the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Golden Age of Cricket podcast. My name is Tom Ford. If ever a cricketer was the creation of a single writer, it is Archie MacLaren, wrote Gideon Haigh in 2006. The luminous majesty with which he is associated owed in a very large degree to his youthful acolyte Neville Cardus. In today's episode of the podcast, I'll attempt to discover the real AC Archie MacLaren with the help of my special guest. MacLaren's cricket career spanned the exact length of the so-called Golden Age. He was an ever-present force in English and Lancastrian cricket for more than a quarter century, and still holds two significant records: the highest first-class innings by an Englishman, and the most test matches captained against Australia. But his legacy remains a conundrum. Was he the noblest Roman, as Cardus assigned him, or a pessimistic grump whose legacy requires continued revision? To help answer these questions, I welcome Giles Wilcock to the podcast, perhaps better known to some of you as Old Ebor. For nearly a decade, Giles's blog and now Substack page has been a treasure trove of excellent research and writing on cricketers who played prior to the Second World War. He has written 3 books, including a biography of George Macaulay and a history of the original English lady cricketers. Via his online publications, he has written extensively on MacLaren and has pondered, more than once, on how we should view MacLaren's cricket feats and his personality from the perspective of a century later. Giles, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So tell us, first of all, a bit more about the Old Ebor blog, which is now on Substack. Who was the original Old Ebor, and what sort of cricket research do you love undertaking the most?
The original Old Ebor, he was a journalist for the Yorkshire Evening Post at the kind of the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. He was called Alfred Pullen. And the reason that I stole his name pretty much is because one of his most famous works, he wrote something called Talks with Old English Cricketers. And what he did, he chased up some of the old professionals that had been playing 20, 30 years before, just to find out what had happened to them and to find out kind of the slightly messy things that had befallen them. And that kind of got me thinking about, well, there's all these stories about old cricketers that people don't really write about much anymore. And that's what got me into it, trying to tell stories about forgotten cricketers and what had happened to them. And that's kind of my main inspiration, if you like. It's looking for a good story to tell, whether that's about a match or about a player. But I tend to find that the best ones, it goes way beyond cricket. So it could be about something that happened to somebody before they became a cricketer, afterwards, or trying to solve a little bit of a mystery about what happened to this player, where did they go to. But anything that is about social history as well. So anything that's about the different types of people playing cricket, or just about English society in general in the late 19th and early 20th century. Um, I particularly like when you can answer some questions that have never been answered before. For example, recently, I've written about this person a few times, the South African Jimmy Blankenberg that played around the First World War. He's somebody that's vanished off the face of the earth, and trying to look into that and what happened to him. That sort of thing that I find most interesting and that I most want to write about.
Well, I absolutely love your writing, and I would encourage any of my listeners, if they don't know Old Ebor, to go online and you'll find Giles's excellent Substack page. And it is reading your work, Giles, it is clearly a labour of love. So at any given time, where do you draw or put your attention? Like, why do you focus on a particular cricketer? Is it simply because you stumble across a fantastic piece of research?
It varies. I have a list of people I want to write about. It's a very long list, and I will work through that occasionally. But quite often might be just a line that I come across somewhere. So, for example, one time I was looking through, I can't remember why, I was looking through Wisden obituaries from, I think it was 1924, and I came across somebody who it talks about was the fastest bowler in England, who I'd never heard of at that time. And so I thought, oh, let's find out about him. Or it could be if something happens and I look up a match or something like that and I think, oh, that player, I wonder what happened to them. Or it could just be because I use the British newspaper archive quite a lot for research. And so sometimes I will just put a random search into that that's cricket related and see what comes up that way. Um, I would love to say that there's a method in it, but it is quite random, and it just what takes my fancy. What do I feel like writing about at the moment? That tends to be the main way it works.
No, I fully agree. I mean, as a fellow researcher, you stumble across the smallest of things. And I mean, speaking of the British newspaper archive, you can be reading about a cricket report, but then you see just slightly to the right a second column about something that's happening in the news at the time. And that's why I think as cricket researchers, we should always keep our vision quite wide and see what else is going and not just focus on the cricket. But we are here today, of course, to talk about a very famous cricketer, so Archie MacLaren. What is your particular fascination with MacLaren? Because as I said in my introduction, you have written about him a few times. What is it exactly about Archie for you?
I think it's because he doesn't quite fit into any box. He is kind of seen as the archetypal amateur. He was kind of a glorious batter, and he was an autocrat, etc., etc. But that doesn't quite work. And then there's the whole myth, which is, like you say, it's mainly down to Neville Carders that he was a genius at everything he did, and that doesn't quite fit either. So you've got this person he's supposed to represent the golden age, and his face doesn't quite fit because he went to public school, which is what all amateurs did then. It's what all the cricket administrators did. So he was part of that establishment, but he didn't go to university, which that didn't happen very often. His personality didn't quite fit. Amateurs were supposed to be these happy, breezy, go-lucky people, but he was miserable, basically. He was just always grumpy. And it's that kind of it's the clash between reality and myth. But it's not even that simple because even though he had his issues with various people, he was a very original thinker. And in some ways, he was ahead of his time as a tactician, certainly. Um, but he just couldn't manage people. He fell out with so many people and these long feuds that went on for years. Um, but even then, there's something about him that's quite likable. My my favorite story about him is that he was always broke. He never had any money. But the second he had some, he'd spend it on his friends. He wouldn't keep it. He wouldn't be buying things for himself. He'd go out and treat all his friends. Um,
Hmm.
Another story that I like about him because he met his wife in Australia in 1894. They got married 4 years later, I think it was,
Hmm.
and they were married for nearly 50 years, and it was obviously a very close marriage. But there's a couple of things that he said about that. For example, he used to like buying antique things, and he bought a statue for the garden when they had a bit of money finally and they had a nice house. He bought a statue for the garden, and his wife said, "You're not having that," and he had to hide it at the back of his garden so that she couldn't see it. And the other story that I really like about him, I mean, his last tour in New Zealand, she was there. It was kind of like a silver wedding present anniversary trip, and there's a match against one of the teams, and there'd been a partnership, and McLaren was captain, and nothing was happening. And his wife sent him out a handwritten message on paper suggesting that he change the bowling, and his expression is something like, "My wife's bossed me around for 25 years. I'll be damned if she's going to boss me around now." And he kind of had a bit of a rage and stuff. And then when everybody had forgotten, he changed the bowling, and he broke the partnership just doing what his wife said. So it's that kind of thing about him. He's not straightforward, and he could be quite petty, but in a quite funny way. I don't know if he was trying to be funny, but for example, when Bill Ponsford broke his record for the highest first class score, it was against Tasmania. And I think it was Wisden reported that this was a new record. And he wrote to Wisden kind of insisting, no, this wasn't a first class match. This is why it's not a first class match. No, I've still got the record. And the amount of time he spent trying to justify himself for mistakes that he'd made, he'd write these long letters to the press explaining, no, this is why I did what I did 20 years ago, and this is why I was right. So he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more, and it's part of the reason I wanted to, I did invite you on this podcast, is to try and understand the man a little better, because he looms large over the golden age of cricket. So he is an important figure. Just on that point you mentioned about him disagreeing with Bill Ponsford's record. Of course, Bill Ponsford then had the last laugh when he scored his second quadruple century, and that was an official record. I think it was against New South Wales just a few years later, and that, I'm sure, probably shushed Archie MacLaren for a while. So, as I say, Giles, I really want to pick your brain about the personality of MacLaren. And as you mentioned, there's just these series of contradictions and various reports from past cricketers and those who knew him about what sort of person he was. One of your excellent pieces of writing is an article titled "Frankly Unpleasant, Disappointingly Petty, a Lovable Rascal. Who was the real Archie MacLaren?" So, do you think it is ever possible to understand the man behind the cricketer?
I think the problem is it depends who you asked, because different people who played with him had very, very different opinions about him. And he wrote a few things himself, but it's not exactly riveting stuff. He was a decent enough writer, but it's all quite bland. And so all we can really do is see him through the eyes of other people. You can analyze his cricket, you can break down his tactics, but when it's actually understanding who he was, we are dependent on the people that wrote about him. So if you asked somebody like Ranji about him, he would have a very different opinion to what Pelham Warner have said about him. Um, so, for example, Ranji really liked him. I believe he was godfather to one of McLaren's children, and they were friends for life, pretty much. Um, Pelham Warner, he would never have said this because he was far too diplomatic, but I don't think they could stand each other because they had a feud going back to 1903 when McLaren was passed over for the captaincy of an MCC side, but they were still at it years later because in 1919, Pelham Warner wrote an anonymous letter, I think it was to the Times, criticising how McLaren had captained England in 1902. And that was what produced, and McLaren wrote this very, very long reply, but he was still having a dig at McLaren nearly 20 years after, saying, no, he was a terrible captain, made a mistake. Um, Stanley Jackson seems to have gotten quite well with him, which is interesting. And he almost used him as a sort of lieutenant in the 1905 Ashes. But then you've got C.B. Fry, who I don't think could stand him. And he was always trying to put the knife in about how terrible McLaren was at this and how terrible he was at that. And then you've got there's not many professionals that spoke about him openly, but SF Barnes pretty much respected him. I don't think he liked him particularly much, but he did really respect him. And so my favorite example of just things aren't always what you'd expect would be Fred Tate, who was the person who supposedly lost the Ashes in 1902, and that's very connected to McLaren's captaincy. But he said years later that MacLaren was the best captain he ever played under. And if I remember rightly, that one Test match was the only time MacLaren ever captained him. But he thought he was a marvelous captain. So all these different people had different opinions, and it tends to be the case that the people who were the amateurs, they either thought he was a terrible, terrible man, or they thought he was, I think, like the quote in the title of the article, that a lovable rogue. They kind of liked his pessimism. They liked the fact he was always grumbling and complaining, but in a kind of, they appreciated it. It was kind of amused them. Then you had the professionals that respected him, and he respected them. But then you got the ones that just thought he was really aloof and he was an autocrat and he wouldn't descend to their level. I suspect, without going all psychoanalytical, I wonder how much of it was he was quite shy and he didn't know how to react with different people, which meant that he came across as a bit of an aloof autocrat that didn't want to be bothered. But when he warmed up, he was actually quite insightful. So to answer your question, I don't think it's possible for us to know, just because we can only see him through the eyes of other people, and their views were wildly different.
It is fascinating, and I'm really intrigued to hear about Sydney Barnes's analysis or opinion, because Barnes, as we know, was never backwards in coming forward. So for him to have had that opinion, and there is a likely reason, which we might be touching on later when we talk about a particular series. But and I think the Australians, we can talk about this later as well. It's interesting to hear many of the international opposition players who had opinions of him as well. Again, it's just this series of contradictions with MacLaren, which leaves him with us today as just this enigma. Again, why we are continually analysing him as a person. If you're enjoying this podcast, perhaps you'd like to support it by buying me, Tom Ford, a coffee. Every little donation helps with the production costs and also inspire me to keep going. You can support by donating as little as $5. Visit buymeacoffee.com/Golden Age of Cricket.
What a naughty boy you are, Archie, Archie. From the day we leave the church, you can bet your life when we're married, you'll have to come off your turf.
Giles, let's return to or go way back to the beginning and talk about MacLaren's early years. He was born in 1871 in Manchester. What do we know about his early years? Was he, for example, raised in a particularly cricket-loving family? Is that where he got his early influence from?
Yes, his family were quite into cricket, and his father was a big lover of cricket, and he made sure that MacLaren and two of his brothers as well got kind of the best possible cricket coaching. Um, and two of MacLaren's brothers also played for Lancashire, so they were pretty able. Then MacLaren went to Harrow, which I think it was one or two of his brothers went there too. And again, he got the best coaching, and that was kind of how he became famous as a cricketer, because he did very, very well at Harrow. And one of the things that stood out was his batting technique, because of all the coaching that he had had. For a schoolboy, he had a very good technique, because a lot of public schoolboy cricketers back in those days were very much just play shots, play shots, play shots. But he certainly, as he got older at school, was able to bat on difficult pitches, which most schoolboys couldn't do. These things are relative, but for a public schoolboy, he had a very good technique on difficult pitches, and it made him famous, because as I'm sure you know, that if you succeeded for Harrow, especially if you succeeded in match against Eton, the big one at Lords every year, you became famous. You were in newspapers. You were almost like a cricketing
Mm.
celebrity. The big thing that held him back, if you like, which might have contributed to some of his shyness, if you like, was that he didn't go to university. Now, the reason for that was simply because his father was fairly wealthy, but he wasn't wealthy enough to send any of his children to university. And in fact, I think after MacLaren's younger brother, I want to say, but after one of MacLaren's brothers went to Harrow, he didn't send the others because he couldn't afford it anymore. And you've also got this whole thing about MacLaren's face not fitting because his father, although he was very wealthy and he was associated with Lancashire County Club, he was a cotton merchant. Now, it made him rich, but back in the late 19th century, the amateur cricketers didn't have backgrounds like that. And if you came from the sort of background, oh, your father's a cotton merchant, your face didn't quite fit. It's almost like the idea of, oh, new money, we don't like you as much. And that will have affected him. And that quite possibly contributed to him always being a little bit of an outsider because not only did he come from a background that didn't quite fit tick all the boxes for amateur cricketers. He didn't have the university background. He didn't have the social connections.
Mm.
And bearing in mind that once he was into the England team and he was the England captain, he was surrounded by all these other amateurs who had gone to university and they had all these social connections and they came from the right sort of family. And it starts to explain a little bit possibly about why why his face never quite fitted.
Well, yes, thank you for that excellent summary. It is something we need to remind ourselves constantly. I think it's too easy to just go black and white with our analysis of the professionals and the amateurs. There really were different levels of amateurs within amateur cricket. And you mentioned it already. I mean, you've got the likes of Stanley Jackson or Ranji, who were next level amateur in terms of their wealth and their freedom to play cricket. And then you had almost the sort of lower class amateur like an Archie Jackson, maybe Gilbert Jessop possibly also in that category. Of course, to be a captain of any side back in the late 19th century, you had to be an amateur. And this is where what you allude to already, this battle for the captain of the England cricket team occurs in 1903-04 between the three amateurs, Fry, Warner and MacLaren. So do you think Archie carried this chip on his shoulder throughout his cricket days? How do we actually assess his level of amateurism?
I think you've explained that perfectly because you had these different levels. You had the ones at the top who were genuinely wealthy, like Lord Hawke, for example,
Mm.
who didn't have to worry about money and could play as much cricket as they wanted and be the perfect amateur. Then you had the ones who they were okay, but they needed to do things to be able to afford to play. People like CB Fry to some extent, certainly Pelham Warner. Then you had the ones who were a little bit struggling financially, and I think that's where McLaren would fit. He didn't quite do what others amateurs did, where you ended up with somebody being a shamateur, which was basically somebody who was an amateur in name, but was secretly paid to play. Now, McLaren, he did to some extent because he became Lancashire's quote assistant secretary, which meant nothing. It just meant that it was an excuse to pay him money. And if I remember rightly, he was paid more as assistant secretary than the professionals were paid to play for Lancashire. He wasn't the only one who did that. Um, but he wasn't the worst. So, for example, the ones who are the absolute worst for just making a mockery of the system will be somebody like W.G. Grace, who made an astonishing amount of money from playing cricket for somebody who was an amateur. But then another really notorious one would be Walter Reed of Surrey, who just was raking money in as an amateur cricketer. So MacLaren never kind of stooped to that level, if you like. But he was never one of those genuine amateurs who could just play when he wanted. He always had to have money coming in from somewhere else. But the other side to it, as well as having the different levels of amateurism, it was being an amateur cricketer was never just about money. It was basically code for class.
Mm.
And if you were an amateur, what that basically told everybody was that you were kind of upper middle class or upper class. Whereas if you were a professional, you were lower middle class or, worst of all, working class, shock horror. And so that made a big difference. Somebody like MacLaren could never have been a professional because it would have basically meant giving up his social status outside of cricket. So for somebody like that, it was never an option. You had to find a way to stay as an amateur or just to get out of cricket completely. Um, and then that's when you come back to the idea of his background and made it difficult because having a cotton merchant as a father made it quite difficult to say, yes, I am in that social elite. And that made it even more important for him and for other cricketers like him, somebody like Andrew Stoddart. It made it really important to be saying, look, I'm an amateur. Look, I am one of you, even if my background doesn't quite fit.
The other aspect with MacLaren, you mentioned his wife already, Maud, I think his wife's name was, whom he met in Australia on his first tour of Australia in that famous 94-95 series. She was the daughter of a very wealthy Australian, and so he knew that there was money coming at some stage, and I think that also played a factor into his status. He was going to be very rich at one point, but I think they had to wait until the 1930s to acquire it. And, it is a similar story to Billy Murdoch, actually, the famous Australian captain who migrated to England, played county cricket with Grace. He too sort of married wealth and was constantly, I was about to say jet setting, but this is 19th century, shipping back and forth to Australia to work out the estate, and eventually the money came. So again, that's another aspect of why these amateurs aren't always just lumped or shouldn't be lumped into the same category. I did a bit of research, Giles, into because of his status, MacLaren had to work essentially, unlike some of the other amateurs. So I've come up with this list of all the little odd jobs that he did throughout his cricket career. So if you'll let me just read them out. So these are just some of the jobs he dabbled in over the years: journalism, radio broadcasting, advertising, hotel ownership, bloodstock agent, banking, cotton merchant, marketing of cricket equipment, a whiskey salesman, motorcar salesman. He was once a film extra in Hollywood, cricket magazine editor, cricket coach. He was a lecturer. He hired out cricket films. He was the manager of a private team, a schoolmaster at one point, personal secretary to Ranjit Singh, which you've mentioned, and assistant secretary to the Lancashire County Cricket Club. How do we assess all of this? It's not like he was just a schoolmaster all those years. So he dabbled in so many different areas. Were jobs just a means to an end for him, just so they would enable him to have a lifestyle of playing cricket?
It must have been something like that. I think part of it was he was always kind of scrambling around for money. He never had enough just to live the lifestyle he wanted, never mind played cricket. But he must have really liked cricket, which would explain why he was always trying to find ways to play it. He did threaten to leave it once or twice and do something else, and he was always threatening to leave Lancashire if they didn't give him more money. But it's almost, maybe it could be something like that. Cricket brought the social trappings that he wanted. It helped him to reinforce that status. Or it could just have been that he loved the game. It's very hard to say. But the other thing I wonder is, did he never quite find his niche? He was a cricketer, but what else was he? And if you think of other famous amateurs from the time, they usually had something else, whether it was journalist or stockbroker or whatever it might have been. But for MacLaren, he never quite had that. It could be that he was restless. It could be that he didn't know what he wanted. It could be he was always looking for something. Or the other possibility with MacLaren, which you can never rule out, is that if he stayed anywhere too long, he just annoyed the people that he worked with to the point that he had to get out. I think one of the most revealing stories is, you mentioned about the magazine Cricket, and that had been going for years. I think it was 1882 it first
Mm.
started, and by I think by about 1911, 1912, it was really struggling. And the editor of Cricket was a man called J.N. Pentelow. He was just a general cricket writer. He wrote a huge amount of things. Quite an interesting person in his own right, actually. And he ended up as editor, and it was just sinking. And so in 1913, it folded, and then it relaunched under a very slightly new title. And suddenly, Pentelow wasn't the editor, he was the assistant editor, and the editor was supposedly Archie MacLaren, which basically meant that he wrote a few articles for it, and he had his name on the masthead and things like that. But it doesn't seem that he did an awful lot for the money he was being paid, and depending on who you read, it does look a little bit as if just the money vanished and it folded around about the time that the First World War started. And it folded suddenly because the very last issue, it talks about next issue we'll be doing this, and it just stops forever. And apparently, Pentelow just found the whole thing very stressful, and it was kind of MacLaren's fault that he just horribly mismanaged it once he came on board. So yeah, it could just be that wherever he went, he kind of left a trail of wreckage around him. And we don't know much about all the things he did, but in quite a lot of them, it ends with a falling out. Like he was employed by Lancashire twice in the early 1900s and the 1920s, and both times he was quietly let go because of personality clashes.
I know exactly what you mean in regards to Cricket magazine, because I was perusing the 1913, 1914 editions recently, and if you know the other previous editions, you suddenly come to 1913 and the masthead proudly says, I think, edited by Archie MacLaren. I mean, it sort of speaks to, I think, this image he also probably wanted to project of himself, that he was this cricket editor and a great journalist. But of course, it didn't really eventuate it. I actually enjoy some of his writing. I think what he writes on the state of cricket is actually, at times, it seems at least truthful, unlike perhaps the writing of Pelham Warner, which can sometimes just be a bit convoluted and sort of high-handed, and you feel like he's writing just to please a particular somebody at Lord's. But there are certainly elements of MacLaren's writing which I just think are to the point and actually quite perceptive. But yeah, and you know, those magazines are readily available. So if anyone's interested, you'll easily be able to find the writing of Archie MacLaren. So, Giles, let's talk about this relationship with Ranji, and in particular this job, which I had never actually heard about until I read Simon Wilde's biography of Ranji a few years ago, and suddenly he talks about MacLaren being his personal secretary. I think from about 1903 to 1908. What do we know about, I suppose in modern terms, we would say position description? what what did the job entail? And do you think MacLaren was very good at whatever it was he was required to do?
It's quite vague what what it actually involved. I think it was a little bit of everything. I think his official title was personal secretary. The only thing that kind of survives about what he did is that he used to write a lot of letters. So I think he would have dealt with correspondence, things like that. But he was also involved in negotiating a few things. It seems to have come about because they were very good friends. And I think when Ranji was trying to um, take the throne of Nawanaga, he needed somebody to help him because he had huge amounts of correspondence about it with all sorts, and it seems to have kind of evolved from that, and it pretty much ruined McLaren's cricket career, to be honest, because he was never quite the same once he started working for Ranji. He didn't have the time, and he was taken up with all that, and his role is very slightly opaque because they seem to have got up to all sorts of things. Um, the the one that always springs out to me is that when Ranji came back to England in 1908 and he brought McLaren with him, he basically Ranji spent most of his time trying to avoid people chasing him for money that he owed because he owed a huge amount of money because he spent money he didn't have. And my favorite little story from that is that there was an artist who Ranji had commissioned to do, I think it was like a profile miniature, something like that. And she negotiated with McLaren about how much it was going to cost and when she'd do it and everything like that. And she came and she did the portrait of Ranji, and he was delighted with it. She went away, and they spent months, Ranji and McLaren, just making excuses for why they weren't going to pay. First of all, it was, oh, we'll pay you soon. Then it was, oh, actually, we don't like this very much. And she had to go to court to try and get them to pay. And eventually it went all the way up to the India office because it was a massive embarrassment because you had an Indian prince in England who was just not paying money that he owed. She wasn't the only case. There were loads of these people that were chasing Ranji through the court. And my favorite line in the adjudication of the India office was somebody, I can't remember who it was that wrote it, but somebody talked about McLaren and they described him as Ranji's ridiculous private secretary, which I think says everything you need to know about the impression he made on people. And around about the same time as well, when he was still working for Ranji, McLaren was taken to court himself for non-payment of rent, and he kind of disputed it in court, and he claimed that, well, actually, no, it wasn't him that was renting it. It was Ranji that was renting it on his behalf. And to try and get out of all his money, whereas Ranji was also putting this idea forward that he couldn't be prosecuted because he was a ruling prince, and so as a head of state, you can't prosecute me in court. And McLaren tried to claim, no, you can't prosecute me because it's actually Ranji's house, and so no, I don't have to pay this. And in the end, the magistrate said, no, you have to pay this, and he did pay up, although where he got the money from is another question. And I think in Simon Wilde's biography of Ranji, he uses a very nice line about something like the exploits of Ranji and McLaren will never be known, but the closest it seems to be is an actual real life version of Raffles, the cricketing thief. So they do seem to have bent the rules slightly to get around their financial troubles.
Yeah, it's a very interesting relationship, and what you said at the top was very interesting. How it pretty much ruined his McLaren's career, and if you look at certainly his Test career, he's very prominent in the English side and captain right up until that 03-04 tour, and then he sort of disappears and he comes back for the 1909 home series against Australia, which we'll certainly talk about, and that corresponds beautifully with those years in which he was working for Ranji